Now I want to bring in another dimension of this and get your thinking about whether there are any ancient philosophies that pull this together. Having lived, of course, in the West, and also Fran and I lived in Southeast Asia for 15 years, and if you kind of move this to the extreme, and in ways it's not that extreme, it's pretty close to reality. In the West, I'm amazed at how many of our conversations, anytime we get into an established theoretical framework, it's the individual looking out at the larger system, totally defined through the individual. And I'm working with some management professors on this about how that plays out in terms of the firm, the corporation, and organizing around the corporation. Now, if you go to Asia, I mean the traditional frame, the individual almost doesn't exist. It's the community. And so there's this deep contrast. And what fascinates me, I got introduced to this actually by a Chinese woman living in the UK who was a very advanced microbiologist, deep in the science. And her fascination was understanding how life actually organizes. So she would talk about the body and this mention of the tens of trillions of cells. But as you get your head into that in terms of what the cells are doing, it is as if every cell is a decision maker, but making decisions with a mental frame that says, I am both an individual, the group absolutely depends on me and my choices, and yet I do not exist without the group. And it's almost like trying to hold in your mind both frames of an optical illusion at the same time, which, as you know, is very hard to do.
Sounds like motherhood.
I love it. In any of the philosophies that you have looked at, do we get into that kind of a balance and how that plays out between individuals and groups?
Yeah, what a beautiful question. Thank you for asking that. And really where my mind goes is definitely the Chinese way of looking at what it is to be a human being. And just as you say, the traditional Chinese sense of identity was actually not as an individual. So you would ask, if you'd ask a Chinese person to describe how she identifies herself, it would be in relation to. So in relation to the family, my role in the family, and then the family in relation to the community, my role in the community, and then the community in relation to larger society. And so much so that this notion of the individual wanting to just kind of optimize for themselves, which we take as a given, and this great discipline of economics, as you point out, has this kind of fallacy that's based on that, well, individuals are selfish rationalizers who want to maximize themselves. It's bunk. I mean, it's this kind of...
And that will result in the absolute best outcome.
Exactly. And both of those, that first premise and the second, are both bunk. And in fact, what we see, what's so interesting is in East Asian cultures, not just in traditional cultures, but all the way to modern times, there are these really ingenious social psychology experiments they do to show how even modern East Asian people see reality in a different way than we do in the West. So, for example, they'll show a picture, maybe of like a fish and a background, and ask Westerners and East Asian people to describe the picture. So the Westerners will mostly focus on the fish. you know, the fish look like this, that, and the other, and you ask them about the background, they won't even recognize that. Whereas an East Asian person is more likely to say, I noticed that there was this pattern and there was a shoal of fish in the further background of the. They see the fish in context of everything else because that's just the natural way that they're looking at stuff. And you see this playing out all around in different ways of making sense of things. So that's kind of a natural way of thinking that arises from that traditional Chinese model. But then I think where I see the opportunity is for us when we grow up in the West, when we grow up in these kind of individual mindsets, to realize that we can gain that wisdom, but again, we can also use the findings of systems thinking to recognize that that is actually also true of ourselves in reality. So there's this notion that arises from theories of self-organization and complexity theory. This notion of fractals, and maybe just curious, can you put up your hand if you're familiar with the term fractal? Yeah, so most people are, and it's this notion of patterns that organize themselves at different scales. And actually, when biologists or physicists are looking for signs of self-organization in a system, they'll look for fractality in that system, because when systems self-organize, they do that. They organize in different scales. And as you do that, you can recognize that we as humans are really just part of what is sometimes called the holarchy, which is really like the set of fractals that make up the whole universe. So as you were describing so beautifully, as humans, we have self-organized systems within us, in our organs, and the organs are composed of cells, and so all of these things are happening within us, and then we can identify ourselves as being part of a community. The community is being part of an ecosystem, both in the human ecosystem and the natural, and all of that being part of Gaia. And we can recognize the traditional Chinese understanding of Tao, which is really the way in which nature expresses itself in this kind of massive self-organized way, as being their version of what we can consider as Gaia and our role in that. So I feel that we can learn so much from this traditional wisdom and from our own, from what Western science offers us, if we recognize the right kind of science and recognize that a lot of what we're told as science today is quote, science. There's actually one branch of science that's called reductionist science, which is very effective in building technology, but not so effective in understanding our place in the universe.